Hi, I'm Jeremy Easterbrook from Index. There are major changes coming to Facebook advertising in 2021. Are you ready? In this video, I'll cover how tracking transparency in iOS 14 is bringing major changes. It's going to require apps to ask for permission before tracking user activity. And that includes Facebook, where it's going to be limited to collect user information. So I'm going to be with Michael Kinnunen, Director of Performance at Index. Hi, Mike.
Hello.
So, Mike, first, just tell us, what's upcoming? Why should we pay attention to this?
So we're talking today about the Facebook changes. Quickly, just I think most people would be at least aware of this, but in part because of all the complaints that Facebook's been making. iOS 14 will be coming soon to iPhones. With it, Apple will be releasing some new standards on personal identification security across the board. And what we're talking about today is Facebook's solution to meet these new requirements by Apple.
Why is Facebook looking to put in place those changes? So, from their official standpoint, and Apple as well.
Well, Apple, the reason Apple's doing it, there are many reasons, but I can't specifically say other than their marketing material. I guess the simplest one is Apple does not make money off advertising; they make it off subscriptions and products. So um, there's less, there's no incentive for them to worry about advertising, unlike Google or Facebook, which make all their money from advertising. So um, there's just two different business models, and because of that, or for whatever reasons, Apple's positioned themselves as someone who values privacy, and provides that with their devices. So Facebook has to meet these new requirements, or they will not be able to advertise with Apple's on the Apple iPhone. What that is going to look like from a user standpoint is when you open a new app, there'll be a pop-up and it will ask you, will you let this person, or do you want this app to track your activity across into another app? And if the person says no, then they won't be able to track the activity across. The most obvious example is this: is someone's on the Facebook app and someone said no, and they clicked on an ad on the Facebook app. Technically, with the way Apple has implemented the solution, you wouldn't be able to track that. You wouldn't be able to track if they went on the actual device and the behavior after. There's some subtleties. That's not the whole story, but this is kind of the starting point.
And if I'm marketing myself, like which roles in an organization do you think this is going to affect, and who should be aware of these changes?
It's really only going to impact the people doing the paid advertising. It's going to impact how you have to set up the accounts. It's going to impact the reporting, and it will impact. It could, if not done correctly. I'm going to put it that way. It could, if not done correctly, impact the performance of the campaigns as well.
I think another one would be how would it affect us more if we have a larger organization? Because if I'm correct, this applies to one domain. So if I have multiple agencies working on the same domain, that's going to affect me even more.
I guess, yeah. So backing up a step, I talked quickly about, and I should mention, some of this stuff is pretty dynamic, and we'll talk about why it's so dynamic here in a second. I talked first about what Apple had done. It's important to understand, and I can get a little fuzzy, but it's important to understand that what you'll have to do in these new Facebook limitations and restrictions are not Apple's requirements. They are Facebook's solution to meet these new privacy requirements by Apple. So it's a slightly different thing, but it's being forced upon Facebook because of this iOS update. The other thing to remember, or the other thing to know, is Facebook has said that they don't they don't have multiple solutions. So this is going to impact all advertising, not just on the Facebook iOS. Some of the limitations we'll talk about will only be if people opt out, but the entire system is going to change, not just for apps or people who opt out on the Facebook iOS. And just the couple major things. There's so many things I recommend taking a look at one of the webinars, but the big thing that most advertisers are going to feel the impact of is the 8 event limit. And what that means is going forward, you'll only be able to track 8 events on Facebook, no more. Any events outside of those top 8 can only be tracked for custom audiences or lookalike audiences. You can't actually report on them, or you can't optimize campaigns on them.
Exactly. And why does 8 event import me? As you know, obviously I'm an organization, so if most of the times I just have one KPI. Let's say I'm in e-commerce, I have a purchase, or if I'm a university and I have a registration form. So why would just 8? Isn't that way enough for most advertisers?
For all small advertisers, yes. For most small advertisers, it will not impact you. The biggest impact will be on reporting, and it may impact, depending on how you set it up, some of your optimizations. But let's use, for example, if we're using Facebook and you set up their automatic tracking that they automatically scan the site. And so you're getting information on the number of clicks that people were doing, the number of registrations, a number of these. These are all separate events that are getting tracking. And depending on how you're optimizing the campaign, you might be getting near your 8. But that's pretty easy to set up. You can, with someone who's got some experience with Facebook, they can easily set up your pixel and manually set up your events, just remove that. And so 8 events is going to be more than enough. And you really don't need to worry about anything. If you've got 1 pixel and 3 events, for all intents and purposes, the change will happen and you'll never notice. Where it does impact larger companies is if you have multiple agencies or if you have multiple campaigns. So if you have an agency or campaign or even a country and the entire website is under the .com domain, that means that all those agencies across all those countries have a maximum of 8 events they can optimize conversions are, which you can understand that'd be pretty difficult if you had, let's say you had your website was .com, you didn't have it set up as a .ca or something else, and you had an agency in Mexico managing 10 different areas, and you had it in the United States managing 20, and then in Canada managing 3 or 4. You probably would have a pixel with their own custom events set up for each of those. And for all intents and purposes, all of that has to go away.
And you mentioned the impact. So obviously there's going to be a pop-up that's going to show to users when they arrive on the app, and Apple is going to ask permissions. But how big of a proportion of the users typically do we see on, like, how big of a chunk of users is iOS 14?
It will be different for every person. I don't have the most recent stats on me, so I apologize if these are slightly off. But let's say 75% of users who surf Facebook are on mobile, maybe even more, 75, 80%. Half of those users are usually iPhone users, maybe 40%, 50%. Most people who see a pop-up about asking if they want more data privacy are probably going to put yes. So you could be looking at a quarter of your users now are going to be opting out. But it's important to remember these changes will impact everything. What happens when someone opts out is a little different. But those 8 events that's for everyone, period. Now, what happens when someone opts out is a little different. All of a sudden now there's a priority list that you can control in Events Manager, and that already exists. All of a sudden that becomes important, because now, I want to be clear, you will only report on the highest prioritized event. And there's a secondary thing. If, for instance, you were running a Facebook campaign and you were optimizing for 2 different events, so this would be a scenario where you had a phone call click event and a registration event, and you would prioritize the registration event as your number one event and phone call click as 4. If someone opted out, you would only be optimizing on that top ranked event. So you're basically only if one event gets used. Now there is a third scenario where if you think about it, if you had 2 different events with overlap, but you were optimizing on, if the campaign or ad group was not being optimized on the highest ranking event, then for reporting purposes, you're going to see the higher ranking event. But for optimization purposes, you're only actually optimizing on the event for the campaign. So event, I think one of the questions I asked in chat was specifically around that, where if you had event 4 for campaign 4 and event 4 and event 1, let's say event, for the purpose of this discussion, event 4 and event 1 were the exact same. You would never do this. If someone actually registered, you would be optimizing that on event 4 if that's what your the campaign or ad group is optimized for, but you would only ever see event 1 in reporting because that was the highest prioritized one. So in there you get this weird disconnect between reporting and actual optimization, which can be a little confusing, especially if you're trying to do it from a reporting perspective. The last one, and this is kind of another peculiarity, is that waterfall effect going down. So you can imagine you have these prioritized events. If someone visited your site, we're going to use the registration and phone call, and let's say registration was 1 and phone call click was 2. Someone visited the site and they registered and clicked on a phone call, but had opted out of iOS, you would only ever see the registration event, and you would only be optimizing on the one event. Now, in most cases, that doesn't really matter, but you would only ever see that registration event. Versus if someone else came on the site, didn't register, but clicked on the phone call link, then you would only see the phone call link click. And if you had a third event, let's say visited a checkout page, and let's say that was your lowest priority event, that would only show if none of the other more prioritized events occurred for someone opted out. Whereas if someone hadn't opted out on iOS, an Android user, or someone who just didn't, you would still see all the events. So you can imagine when you go back and look at your events, if you ever looked at it from a device standpoint, you're going to get a lot more conversions on your Android devices than you are going to on your Apple devices. So you have to understand, or has to be awareness that from Facebook's own reporting standpoint, you're going to lose a lot of data.
The CPA algorithm, where Facebook tries to optimize the campaigns, might be not as efficient in terms of, especially if everything we just talked about, this cascade of events, if it's not configured correctly.
Correct. You're definitely, it's a good point. You're definitely going to have to watch out for that. More often than not, though, most people are optimizing on one event, sometimes 2 or 3. We're working on solutions here where then what we do to limit the number of events. In most cases, what happens is, or often in my experience, you'll have a major event and maybe optimized for that event, or you'd optimize for 2 or 3 events. We're working on combining, making that combination a single event through GTM itself. So then you can have multiple combinations on that side, because if someone opts out, you're not going to be able to optimize on both events. So you're going to miss out on specific data sometimes. Whereas if you actually create an event which has both of them in there, then that will fire regardless of which one occurs, kind of thing. So it's just one workaround. There's multiple different ways of approaching this. It all depends on the organization as well.
So let's assume that my organization, or whoever is listening in right now, is going to be affected because of those upcoming changes from Apple, and also because of Facebook's trying to follow up. So when is that happening, and what kind of changes should I look into making right now in my setup, in my organization?
Number one is you need to make sure your domain is verified with Facebook. That's going to be a big one. in all cases, and I don't know if it's been properly explained or what the reasons are, but in some cases you won't, but that could be an issue. So the first thing you want to do is make sure your domain is verified with Facebook. Second is you'll want to make sure you want to see if this event thing is going to be an issue for you. Facebook will automatically prioritize the events for you. Um, so if you have one event, it doesn't matter. Fine already, Facebook has set it up. But if you have multiple events, multiple agencies, then you need to have those discussions really quickly because timeline, Facebook will continue to run everything as is until iOS enforces the prompts. And then as soon as iOS starts enforcing the prompts, everything will switch over. And if you have a campaign or an ad group, an ad group or ad optimized specifically on an event that doesn't exist, all those ads will stop.
And that would be kind of dramatic in terms of objectives and such. And the other thing as well is, I guess you need to talk to your agencies to make sure they're prepared and have a list of pixels that are running, and if they're running multiple accounts. So I guess ownership has to go back to the organization as well to make sure everything, or at least a main agency where everything is delegated correctly.
Yeah, whoever's, again, whether it's in-house or whether it's being run with an agency, you need to have an idea yesterday what's going on with this. This is something that could be absolutely nothing. This is something that could literally mean all your campaigns stop and you're scrambling around, and there is no specific timeline on this. So yeah, whoever's managing that needs to make sure that you own your pixel. There's often times where an agency will own the pixel through Events Manager. You need to make sure that the company actually owns that pixel so they can manage that for the agencies on that side. You need to make sure that you actually are under the 8 events, that the 8 events that do exist there, you know what they are and are prioritized correctly. So it's a bit of work. It's a bit of a scramble, and it's clear. I think it's clear to everyone that this is rushed. 2 weeks ago, in my personal experience, some Facebook chat weren't even aware of this. Like literally, questions were sent, and they had no idea what we were talking about 2-3 weeks ago. Now there's been a few webinars. There's a lot more information, a lot more details, but literally, most days, still every day, and we're now in the part of implementation. I'll write a question, and the chat will literally have to stop and ask someone because it's not been asked before. So this is brand new. It's it's just being rushed, and Facebook doesn't. It's not Facebook rushing this. It's Facebook trying to play catch up.
And it's hard to find information on the subject as well because there's literally no information. So we're lucky to have attended those 2 webinars that Facebook did, and there's nothing upcoming, and nobody's talking about this on the YouTube or just the literature that's available on the subject.
Well, there's a resource. There is a resource center on Facebook which I have explored. I just didn't find it that helpful. Partially because it's so new, and many times in these discussions, a lot of questions are brought up by other people, but I didn't find it that helpful at the start. It is also because it's so new. For instance, there's a lot of times where you'll have a very basic question where it's like, well, how do I set this up, or what's the best way to set this up? And they don't have a clue because every situation is different, and they don't even have case studies or examples of how to set this up. So this is you're having to come up with your own creative solutions from the limited information given. So that's in many ways I find that's the interesting stuff, but it's also something that is not always that easy to do, and if you're not really familiar with the platform.
Well, I think, Mike, we've done a good overview of what's coming up on Facebook iOS 14. So thanks a lot. And definitely one thing is please reach out to us, and if you want to talk to Mike, that's possible, but we have a team of experts here that can help you doing this transition at Index. And Mike, any last words about about Facebook in general?
The last thing I will say is and I'm only saying this because I'm usually pretty hard on Facebook support. Within
Okay.
the last week, if you have a question, a detailed question that you have, the Facebook support in the last week or two has gotten a little bit better. And because I guess not to stress it, this is literally every single question they're now getting asked. So so they are well aware of at this point of just even a fraction of the concerns. And so it is you can actually get some information right now from the Facebook support if you have very detailed questions or something along those lines that you run into. So I would give credit to Facebook. It's the one thing I will say that they are have improved in the last few weeks on versus a few weeks ago where the chat literally had no idea what I was referring to.
Yeah, and hopefully that does help user privacy, which obviously is very important, and we hope tracking gets a little bit less creepy out there. All right, well, thanks a lot, Mike. Have a good day, and feel free, guys, to reach out to us if there's anything.